Hey everybody, it's good to be here. I don't think I have anything to tell you. I want to say again that at the end of May, as I told you last week, that I will be going on a sabbatical, but we're going to keep right on going. We'll get as far as we can until then. And today we're finishing up, I hope, in chapter 8, the first part where Jesus feeds the 4,000. What I'll do here in a second after I pray is I'll just read the whole passage again, and then we'll start where we left off, which was right after the disciples had questioned about where they're supposed to get food. We'll talk about that in a second, but let me just pray for us and we'll get going. Father, I am thankful that we have this opportunity to study your word, and I'm thankful we have particularly this story, in that it's one place that we have it, and it's so helpful for us to understand your son's heart. Help me, Lord, to focus in on what is important to you, and that this time will be an encouragement to anyone who joins us in studying your word, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let me just start reading. I'm going to start reading in verse 1 of chapter 8. I'll just read through this, and then we'll jump in. About this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Jesus called his disciples and told them, I feel sorry for these people. They've been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance. And his disciples replied, How are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness? Jesus asked, How much bread do you have? 7 loaves, they replied. So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to his disciples, who distributed the bread to the crowd. A few small fish were found too. So Jesus also blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. They ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food, and there were about 4,000 people in the crowd that day. And Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. And immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of Dalmanutha. Okay, last week we stopped just after the disciples had brought up this question about how are they supposed to find food for all these people, and their question to Jesus is actually met by a question from Jesus. He doesn't respond to their question about how are we supposed to find food out in the wilderness. No, he says, how many loaves do you have? And that's just literally what it says, how many loaves do you have? And they say 7. Now, I'm just going to say that there are a lot of numbers in what I just read. 7 is an important number, and I don't really want to make too much of these numbers, but they're here and they make sense in a lot of other ways. So we're going to talk about it. The number 7, as you may know, if you've been in classes with me before, is the number of God. It's the number of completion. It's the number of days that God took to make the world. And anytime we run into a number 7, when we run into these numbers, we have to go, okay, is there something special about the fact that there were 7 loaves? Is this important? We'll talk about that in a minute. But they start with 7, which is the full number of God doing a complete work, okay? And it also says here later that there were a few small fish. So he's got 7 loaves and a few small fish. By the way, the fish here is diminutive, like fishy. I find that funny, but it's there to let us know that these are little fish. They're not big fish. And what we see is Jesus, he's going to take charge. He's going to command everybody, he commands everybody. The word here is recline in the Greek. And if you might recall that any time that people are eating and they're reclining, that means lying on their side And that's the position of eating at a banquet. And so he's not telling them just to sit down and we'll serve you food. He's saying take the position of a person at a big fancy banquet. Now, I may be reading too much into this, but it's a different thing than what happened when he fed the 5,000. And in fact, he doesn't divide the people into 50s and hundreds. Those numbers are important because those are the numbers of a Jewish military outfit. They divided their soldiers into these groups. This group is not a group of Jewish people. It's a group of Gentile people, so he doesn't have any picture of something Jewish going on at all. And he takes the loaves. He's got all these people, all these Gentile people, and they're all laying down the side, reclined, ready to eat. And he takes the loaves, and in typical Jewish fashion, he thanks God for them. And then he begins to break the bread. Now, this whole business of thanking God is typical Jewish practice. By the way, we say we're going to have a blessing, or we bless the food and all that. So that's not at all what happens in the scripture. What happens is they thank God for it. They don't ask God to bless it. That comes from, now the word is used later, we'll talk about it in a minute, but it's an idea that would have been foreign to the first century Jewish people when they talked about eating a meal. They were thankful that God had given it to them. In fact, their thinking was that God had already blessed it to make it possible for them to have it. And so they're going to thank him that they now have it. I think, when we use that term, blessing the meal, ask a blessing, we don't even know what we're talking about. It's just a phrase we use. But it was not the habit of Jewish people then. Now, he starts to break this bread and then eventually the fish up so they could pass it out. Now, I'm just going to say, there's something like, this is a higher level thought right here about what Jesus is doing. The ancient world was not a world that was divided into the thinking of natural and supernatural. They didn't even have those categories. They would have never thought about it that way. All of the things that we throw into the natural world, stuff that just happens because it happens, existed. It went about because, now in the pagan world, because the gods were in control of these things. But in the Jewish world, it was because God was in control. And the primary aspect of feeding came from, their thinking about feeding people came from the fact that God made food multiply. Now follow me in this. God made fish multiply so they would have fish to eat. God made grain multiply so that they could eventually have enough grain to make bread. This is true. This is a world unlike ours at all. Everything is natural. Everything comes out of processes where multiplication is the issue. And who's responsible for multiplication? God. God does this. It's not a natural process. It is something that he is working over. And when Jesus begins to break the bread, he's multiplying the bread. When he begins to break the fish, I don't know how he served the little fish, but when they start to multiply, what he's doing at the highest of theological levels is he's saying, I am God. Because I can take a system of multiplication, which I control in another way generally, and speed it up and make it happen right here. He is making a broad statement about his divinity when he multiplies food faster than it should. Did you see what I'm saying? This is true all over the place. Water becomes wine because it goes through a system. In John, he turns water to wine like this. because he's God and he can make the system work. He can multiply. He can do these things. There's so many of the miracles of Jesus related to this kind of stuff are all signs of him being God because he can control the timing of the system. And I just want us to remember that this is like at a really high level. Now, I can't imagine that the disciples were thinking, he must be God because he's multiplying fish. They were probably thinking, what's that about? Because, I mean, there was some multiplication of food in the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, but this is probably throwing them at some level. But I just want to say that the language here leads us to we have to deal with the fact that Jesus is making a tremendous statement about his Godhead in the multiplication of food. Also, there's Last Supper language. When we get to the Last Supper, it's the same language. It's the same Greek when he breaks the bread. Now, there are no fish at the Last Supper that are talked about, but the bread breaking, it's the same Greek. And so there's this connection. All these connections are going on. I'm sure Peter remembered these moments. I can't imagine what it would have been like to. I've often tried to picture what it would look like to just keep breaking bread or to have fish. I've seen some movies where they try to do it, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But I'm sure that it stuck with Peter and he just couldn't help but talk about it. Jesus says he then gives the pieces to his disciples and they serve the crowd. I love the fact that it says they serve the crowd. The Greek here is really cool. You know, that the whole notion of serving is the word that we get later in the diaconous words of deacons and things like that. Here are the disciples. They're not playing any part in this except they're servants to this vast crowd to accomplish the will of whom? God. There's something cool about that, I just have to say. So now, some commentators point out that there were 7 Greek-speaking deacons in the book of Acts who were then brought together. Stephen was one of them, if you recall, brought together to serve the Greek-speaking Jewish widows in Acts 6. And that we start out with 7 loaves and all these numbers are working together. I don't know. There probably isn't any important connection here, but we do have, what we have right here is 12 Jewish men, and 12 is the number that always represents the nation united with 7 loaves, and 7 is the completion number of all humanity that God put together and created in the beginning. And he's serving what? These 12 are serving these 7 loaves to Gentiles. There's just something about God's ultimate gathering in of everybody at this very moment. God showing himself as he multiplies and provides for what? The world. It's just kind of cool. I feel that way. Jesus does say, and something that's unusual, when he blesses, it says he blessed the fish. Again, Jews didn't do that. I'm uncertain. A lot of scholars would say that the only reason that it says he blessed the fish was that Mark didn't want to use the same word twice, and so he just used another word to make it sound like his vocabulary was bigger. I don't know. But blessing the fish would have been an unusual action to the Gentile crowd too. I think maybe, I've been thinking about this. Jesus might have used this moment to show the people exactly who it was that was making this meal in the wilderness possible. And so if he prays in a manner that people can hear him and asks the God of Israel, the God of the Jewish people, to bless the food that is now going to go out to all these people, to the fish in particularly, and in blessing, remember, blessing, we think of it as like, when it goes in, make sure it makes us healthy. They wouldn't have thought that at all. When you bless something, what you're asking for it is to be present in abundance, for it to multiply beyond itself, to be good, and in such a vast amount that you can be satisfied. I do think that the last thing that Jesus wanted the crowd to think was that he was some sort of magician. And so maybe he blessed the food in a manner, or he spoke about it in a way that would make sure that everybody knew who he was giving credit to as he was going about this process. I don't know. Again, scholars argue all over the place about it. When you get my notes, you're going to get an excursus on the side about the use of different Greek words so that literature sounds more erudite and stuff like that, but you can read about that. But I just know that in the midst of all this other stuff I'm talking about, Jesus is really in charge. He is really in charge. This was a moment that he envisioned. This is a moment that he controlled. And it all comes out of his compassion, that deep feeling that he had for these people. The next verse says that they ate and were satisfied. The Greek word that gives us satisfied means filled, as in up to the brim. It means that nobody was going, bad. Boy, I wish I could have another helping. They'd all had more than they needed. They were satisfied. And they'd gotten all that from 7 loaves and a few fish. Again, small fish, no less. And what it says next, after this meal is done, is another interesting point. It says, I'll read it again. It says, they ate as much as they wanted, and afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. Now, first off, we start with 7 loaves and we end up with 7 baskets. But this word for basket is really different than in the last story. In the last story, the disciples, when they were done, they filled. And now remember, their first feeding is to Jewish people. It's a Jewish crowd. It's been divided into a Jewish military organization and all this stuff. And when they're done, there are 12. They say 12, and the word is kaphinos. And a kaphinos is a small basket that fishermen would use to carry their fish to market. And so it's like we got 12 tribes of Israel. We got these 12 small baskets of fish. That's what was left over, bread and fish. That's bread. They didn't carry fish at the first feeding. They carried bread. But here the word is spirus. Spirus is something really different. It's a much larger wicker or rope, almost mat-like or pallet-like basket that was used to carry tons of provisions or people. And so the bottom line is that these 7 baskets that they talk about filling here most likely held way, way more bread than the amount of the 12 earlier baskets. And there's clearly something going on here, that the Jewish feeding ended up with 12 baskets of leftovers, and the Gentile feeding is 7. First feeding is food left over in abundance for what? The gathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. Makes sense to me. And then the number 7 implies completion. Completion. It's always the number of God and the complete number. And it symbolizes the full work of God when it comes to people. 7 says that God cares for his entire creation, the fullness of his creation of mankind. And that's what we get because we have a second feeding. In other words, God cares about what? Jews and Gentiles equally. Both of them have what? An abundance left over. That's what he wants for us. Now, I know this may all be conjecture because these numbers, they may or may not mean anything. But it doesn't seem to me that if Peter said the number was 7 and 12, it probably was. That's all I got to say about it. I mean, and then they thought about it later and go, oh my goodness. It is interesting that the number of people, it says, was about 4,000. Now, of course, again, the Greek says now they were about 4,000. It doesn't say men. It doesn't say anything. I will say it's gendered, that they is a masculine. And some people try to say, well, there were actually, and in fact, I think the NLT says there were 4,000 people. I don't know whether they're just trying to be gender neutral or whatever here, but the truth is, the 4,000 is not an unusual number. 40 is the number of a completed process. It's the number of a generation. Anytime you run into a 40, it's trying to tell us that something had a beginning and an end. And 10 is the number of perfection. And 10 times 10, and anytime you double numbers, you know you got to think about it more than normal. Anytime numbers double up, then we got to think about it twice as importantly. And so 10 times 10 is 100 times 40 is 4,000, which is actually telling us this is a number that a completed process that is done perfectly. Now, again, scholars will go, well, they just added the numbers later because they wanted to make us a point with the numbers. I don't know how they knew there were about 4,000 people there, but the number tells us something specific. It tells us that this is a very positive number for us to have for a Gentile crowd. Perfection doubled and a completed process, which means that God is really happy with this group. He's thinking of it as a good thing. Anyway, so now some people say that it's the number of the men and the women and the children together, and I don't know whether it matters that much, but what it does make a difference is this. Well, it would make a difference in the size of the miracle if the men had actually brought their wives and kids, then it'd be a much bigger miracle, but I don't think that's the point. Mark doesn't give us much to work with on that. And to refer to a crowd in the masculine isn't unusual, but what does it do? It shows us the heart of God. It shows us the heart of Jesus. It shows us that he cared enough for these people who had followed him out to hear what he had to say, to feed them in a manner that they could be satisfied. And the numbers indicate all of this in the same way as his action. Two ways to say essentially the same thing in the story. Now, notice again that it's Jesus who sends them home. Did you notice it said Jesus sends them home? The word here used, it says he sent them. Home is not in the Greek, by the way. It just says he sent them. We get the idea that they're going to go home. It's the same word that's going to be used later. Apostolos is going to be the noun form of the word that's going to be used to call the apostles. And you know what the word means. Simply the ones who are sent. And so he sends these people home to do what? To carry home the message of the feeding that they received from the hands of a Jewish prophet who spoke to the Jewish God in a blessing before he did it, and they can go out into their Gentile world and do what? Be apostles of the work of Jesus. It all works to me. I mean, maybe I'm making too much of it, but I just find beautiful connections in this. They go to their homes, and can you imagine the stories? I can't even imagine what the stories would have been like. But Jesus is still in charge. His disciples, other than passing out food and collecting the leftovers, are spectators of Jesus' actions here. And it may be that they are this way just so that they can have a deeper sense of who they're dealing with. I don't know. Once again, the disciples are alone with Jesus. Who took the leftover bread? We don't know. We aren't told. But what the verse says next is really, it's like it says immediately. And it says, immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of Dalmanutha. I've got a lot of notes on Dalmanutha that you'll get when we type these up. But I'm just going to tell you this. We don't have any idea where that place is. No idea whatsoever. It doesn't show up on any maps. It's not a region. It's a nothing. Nobody from Rome who first got this book of Mark would have had any idea about Galilean geography. We just have to assume one thing. They went westward across the lake, and now they're back into Gentile or in Jewish territory. Someplace, we don't know where. But it's a place that everybody at the moment knew where it was. Place names change and all that stuff. But anyway, they've crossed back over, and we're going to run into something cool, a really important process, or a really important moment in the next verses. So that's where we are. Jesus has just fed 4,000. It's the second feeding miracle. I know that some people say that there was only one, and there were two different stories, and there was no compelling reason for him to leave one out because he had two crowds that he had to make happy. But I don't think so at all. I am convinced there were two. Each one showed a different side of Jesus. The first one showed his concern for Jewish people. The second one showed his equal concern for Gentiles. And the details that Mark gives us all speak to the reality of Jesus' compassion, and that it shouts out in this story in spades. And again, it answers the question, who is this man? Who is this man from the earlier part of this whole story? And he is the person who can move nature. He is the person who can speed up multiplication. He is the person who can give us life. And he's also the person who cares for everybody equally. I think that's good news. Okay, hey, thanks. I'll see you next week.